Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. I'm so happy to be back with you guys. My name is Miss Farr from Milton. I'm sorry, from not Milton High School, from Cambridge High School in Milton, Georgia, by way of Atlanta. And I just wanted to kind of recap where we are so far. So for the last couple of days, we've kind of taken you through period 4, and today I'm going to kind of finish everything up. We finished, when I last met with you guys, we had already talked about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. We talked about the need for the change with Shays' Rebellion. And then, of course, kind of coming up with the Constitution and the ratification. And then Mr. Horton kind of picked up talking about the presidencies of Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, kind of building what I like to call creating a nation. And so now, for today's lesson, we're going to talk about Jacksonian democracy, and we're also going to look at some reform movements that happened during the 1800s, and then we're going to kind of show about the big picture of period 4. So yesterday in Twitterverse, I asked you guys a question, kind of wanted to, kind of lay some foundation so that you can understand where we are. So yesterday the question was, what do the following presidents have in common, which was Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Quincy Adams? And the answer was the fact that they were all Secretary of State. And so another thing that a lot of you mentioned that was in common was the fact that they were all wealthy, they were all from Virginia. And that is the case for our first presidents. Up until Andrew Jackson, all of them had that commonality. They were all wealthy, they were all very learned, very educated men, and they all came from the same state. And all of a sudden, this guy comes in who is the exact opposite of all of those gentlemen, and he actually changes the game. And he actually gets the idea to change how presidential elections will be in the future. And he will have his name be referred to as an adjective, kind of like Jefferson. So our warm up is this picture here. You saw this yesterday with Mr. Horton, and you want to look at this, take a few minutes, and I want you to think about if this were a DBQ and it wanted to talk to you about how did the politics change in America from the 1800s up until 1840s. And this was one of the political cartoons that you look at. We're going to do a little bit of hippo here, and we're going to do the point of view, we're going to do the historical context. So I want you to take a few minutes and just look at everything within the cartoon. Okay, so if you don't know, this is Andrew Jackson, and this is the exact opposite of what Andrew Jackson probably wanted to say he actually stood for. He kind of considered himself to be a down home kind of Southern, a real common man's president. And here you have him dressed up as a king. And so let's talk about the historical context. We're looking at the fact that around the time of the second term in Jackson's presidency, he had some issues. We're going to kind of talk about those. He had some battles with individuals, people within his own cabinet, his own vice president, for example, would actually be a person that would be in that kind of thing. You'll notice that he's holding a roll of paper that says veto, which means that he actually exercised his veto power more than any other president prior to him. And if you look at the words around the picture, it says, "Born to command, had I been consulted, King Andrew the First." And so, of course, the president is not supposed to be known as a king, but more as an elected official who's supposed to guide. Andrew Jackson kind of took a different way, it took a different format. So when the author or the artist was actually doing this cartoon around this time, you had to kind of think about the point of view. What are they saying about Andrew Jackson at this time? What are they talking about as far as his presidency? Well, they're talking about the fact that he openly, defiantly, with the Supreme Court, with a lot of rules and laws that they put into place. He had a very hostile relationship with Native Americans, and people were kind of unclear as to why. He had a war with the Second Bank of the United States. Like I said, he had issues with people within his cabinet. He threatened his first vice president. He had a situation where a state had threatened to secede from the Union, and therefore he didn't like that. And so the point of view that they're trying to make is that Andrew Jackson, at the time, while he was supposed to be president, was actually acting as more of a king, and he was acting unlike any other president that had been before them. And so now we're going to kind of talk about Jacksonian democracy and how did he get to this point? All right. So our lesson overview again is we're going to talk about Jackson, and we're going to talk about how he changed the role of federal power, especially with the presidency. We're going to look at some reform movements that are going to happen, that are going to continue on. And if you were kind of looking for something with the CCOT, you kind of take that into consideration, these reform movements that had started previously, and they're going to kind of continue on once we start talking about the Gilded Age. And then, of course, the overall big picture of period 4. We're going to look at the causes and effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government, because we're still trying to figure this out. We're still trying to figure out who should have the most power. Should it be states or should it be the federal government? We're going to look at, again, those reform movements that developed and expanded from 1800 to 1848. And then we're going to look at the politics, economics, and foreign policy that promoted the development of our American identity. So skills that we've been working on, so they're not really new. Claims and evidence, contextualization is always huge, and of course, argumentation. So we are going to do a little bit of DBQ practice as we get started. All right, so before we get started, I want to give a shout out to Mrs. Rogers at Farmington High School. According to her students, that she is an amazing teacher. So thank you, Ms. Rogers, for the work that you do. All right, so let's talk about Jacksonian democracy. And this was referred to as the politics of the common man. You have a guy who actually ran for president in 1820. And he ran against somebody who was a former president's son, and his name was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State. He was also famous for helping kind of draft the whole Monroe Doctrine, as well as some other documents and bills. And so this election was kind of very pivotal. So for those of you who are out there on Twitter, can you tweet the answer of what was so controversial about the election of 1820? Because it left Andrew Jackson in a very bitter mood. And so whomever can get that answer right, and Mr. Horton is watching, he'll let me know. And so he loses that election, and he comes back in 1824, and he ran on the platform of politics of the common man. And one of the things that he noticed that a lot of the presidents did was that they spoke in a language that wasn't fair for the average person. And so he wanted to open up the ability to vote, because back then, in order for you to vote, you had to be a wealthy landowner. And Jackson didn't feel like that was fair. He felt like every man, every hardworking man who was a citizen should have the right to vote. And so he wanted to have what is known as universal male suffrage. So he worked extremely hard during his second campaign for president to help improve education. And one of the things that he talked about was the fact that he was really kind of tired of politicians kind of speaking in languages, kind of sending mixed messages where people couldn't understand it. So he wanted to speak in a normal language. So he kind of spoke to people in a way that they could understand, which is why everybody kind of really liked him and called him the common man's president. One of the things that he talked about too was he wanted to revamp state suffrage laws or voting laws. So he says, you shouldn't have to be a part of a political party, or you shouldn't have to have, owns a certain amount of property in order to vote. And so he also kind of talked about party nominating conventions. He thought about the fact that that should be fair. Like, it shouldn't be where anybody could run. And in the past, what would happen is the two people who had whoever had the highest vote will become president, and whoever had the second most votes will become vice president. And that's how it default. He wanted to kind of talk about the fact that they needed to have conventions, and people needed to decide who they wanted to run for their political party. Because, you still have the Federalists, and then you still have the Democratic Republicans. So he wanted to look at, the popular vote again, because one of the reasons why he was so bitter from the election of 1820 was the fact that he actually did win the popular vote. And so now what he's saying is that instead of allowing the popular vote to decide who becomes president, he wants to have something called an electoral college, where it is the certain amount of votes from each state, and those people who are in the electoral college will vote based off of what the popular vote, which is what we have now. And depending on the state's population, depends on how many electoral college votes a state gets. He believed in a two-party system, even though George Washington in his farewell address kind of warned about party alignments. He thought that, having multiple people running for a office will cause a little bit of confusion. So you need to have two parties. They each have the conventions, and then they will nominate one person, and those two people run against each other. So he said that large political parties are needed in order to campaign to the electorate. And of course, the electoral college is going to be the one who puts that casting vote in based off of the popular vote. And then the other thing that he believed in was a spoil system. Spoil system is the kind of idea of the theory of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So people who gave him money, people who supported his campaign, a lot of, financial support, or they went out and did a lot of things politically, he's going to give them government jobs, whether they actually deserved it or not. So, if he felt like you were a huge supporter of his campaign, then of course he was going to make sure to kind of take care of you. And so he was a huge proponent for that. But of course, Jacksonian democracy will only come into place when he actually wins the election in 1824. But like I said, he ran against John Quincy Adams in the election of 1820, but he lost that election. And so again, my question to Twitterverse is, what was the whole scandal behind that 1820 election? All right, so we're going to watch a quick video about Jackson, kind of giving you an introduction.
Election of 1824 had four major candidates in the running: Henry Clay, William Crawford, Andrew Jackson, the victorious general of the Battle of New Orleans, and John Quincy Adams, son of the country's second president. Since none of the candidates received enough popular votes to win the election, the House of Representatives had to decide the winner. They chose John Quincy Adams, who served until the next election when Andrew Jackson beat him by a landslide. Jackson was the first Westerner to become president. His experience as a pioneer, a lawyer, and then a general gave him a diverse enough background to help him relate more closely to the common people. He saw that the majority of American citizens wanted a government that promoted business and trade. He saw that the federal government's preoccupation with wars and international affairs had worn thin for many people. Small business owners, industrial workers, and westbound settlers all agreed that the country needed less chaos and more order. They wanted more lands opened up for settlement, more laws to encourage industrial development and expand business opportunities. They wanted their country to forget about the rest of the world and to focus on its own growth and internal affairs. Jackson gave them what they wanted. Under his presidency, the power of the federal government increased, while the relative power of the states decreased. Jackson promoted the Western expansion, even when it meant challenging the law. He refused to carry out a Supreme Court ruling that ordered the return of land to Native Americans in Georgia. He was criticized sharply for this action by older political leaders, who felt he was wielding more power than the executive branch of the government was meant to have.
Okay.
Election of 18...
So, talking about the election of 1824, this was kind of what actually that kind of talked about. And it kind of talks about the fact that he kind of referred to this as a corrupt bargain. And so Jackson was very bitter about this. He was extremely upset with the fact that, again, they all kind of split the electoral college votes, but when it came to the popular vote, it would seem like more people were actually in favor of Jackson as opposed to him. And of course, this election kind of ended what was known as the era of good feelings. And so again, Jackson immediately began to campaign again because he felt like he was robbed of that election. And so again, he went along that theory of the rights of the common man and kind of talking about the fact that he wants to kind of end the idea of people stealing democracy. And of course, as the video stated, he was really kind of looking at the fact that he really wanted to kind of look at the role of the federal government and change it so that it was actually more support for those individuals who actually really needed the federal government to kind of step in and make more of a play for them. I wanted to give a shout out to Ethan Fancher, who apparently gets food if he gets a shout out. As Jackson becomes president, he actually looks at what his predecessors have done, and he really realized that a lot of things needed to kind of change. And so it began what's known as the Revolution of 1828. And of course, a revolution basically just means a change. This is the idea of party organization. It kind of talks about the discontent because, we still have taxes that were left over from, the war that we had just recently got out of, which is the War of 1812, which most historians kind of refer to it as the Second American Revolution. And so in order to do this, Jackson felt like he needed to kind of clean up some things. And so he puts into place a bunch of tariffs. And the first one was going to be the tariff of 1828. A lot of people kind of weren't really sure if the tariff was a good idea or a bad idea. Southern states kind of felt like they had actually paid off their taxes, and it was more of the job of the northern states to kind of take care of their role. Because you got to think about the southern states had already really kind of became in it to its own with an agrarian culture, also with the growth of slavery, and also with the fact that cotton was really becoming the dominant product for the South. And of course, the southern states are actually going to become pretty soon pretty dominant in the production of cotton for the world. And so as this starts to happen, what they notice is that voter participation actually increased in this election in 1828 compared to the first election in which Jackson ran in. And so Jackson actually expanded the role of the presidency. He basically, as the video said, he narrowed the scope of the federal government. He actually used his veto power more than any other president. He vetoed things 12 times, more than any of his predecessors. As the video said, he openly was defiant to the Supreme Court with two big cases. He was very hostile towards Native Americans. And then, of course, once those things kind of took place, he actually set his eyes on the Second Bank of the United States. And so this kind of goes into one of the big, huge things that kind of caused a rift between Jackson and his first vice president. And this was known as the nullification crisis. And this has everything to do with something called the Tariff of Abominations, where the southern states, again, with South Carolina leading the way, felt that the federal government had no right to impose a tariff on them. And so the idea was just because the federal government passes down a law doesn't necessarily mean that the states actually have to abide by that. So they decided to declare the tariff null and void. And so this is going to start a crisis where South Carolina is actually going to threaten to secede from the Union. And you'll actually see this come back again. So kind of pay attention if you want to kind of talk about a continuity point as it when it talks about something like this. If this was ever a DBQ, you'll see that that's a trend because South Carolina is going to start leading the way as far as seceding the Union at this point, and then they're going to do it again right before the Civil War starts. So here we go.
In 1832, the year after the new mechanical reaper was invented, Andrew Jackson was re-elected to a second term in the White House. That year, Jackson vetoed a bill that allowed the privately owned Bank of the United States to operate as America's leading financial institution. A year later, he ordered that all the money belonging to the federal government be deposited elsewhere. Jackson's veto was designed to punish the rich and powerful individuals associated with the bank and to destroy the control they maintained over the Treasury of the United States. The year Jackson was re-elected, his former vice president, John C. Calhoun, was in South Carolina in the state legislature working for the passage of the Ordinance for Nullification. This was a controversial new law which nullified, that is overturned, the federal tariff or tax on imported goods. But this state law was illegal under the U.S. Constitution. Nevertheless, South Carolina's angry politicians threatened to secede or break away from the United States if the federal government tried to collect the tax. To put a halt to the rebellion in South Carolina, known as the Nullification Crisis, Jackson nearly sent in troops. But in the end, Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky helped work out a compromise that lowered the tariff. As a result, war was avoided and the Union of States was maintained.
Okay, so a huge coup because that actually could have been what we would have considered to be the first Civil War instead of the Civil War that we will have between the North and the South. Before we continue on, I wanted to talk a very nice shout out. Rahul James wanted to give his APUSH teacher, Miss Murphy, a shout out from the students of Montgomery High School in New Jersey. Says that she taught in Manhattan on the day and the weeks following 9/11, and she has taught through this pandemic without missing a beat. So Miss Murphy, your students love you, and great, congratulations on that. So I love shout outs like that and love hearing about teachers who are still doing awesome and their students love them. All right, so let's talk about the nullification crisis a little bit more. Even though Jackson kind of claimed that he was a states' rights supporter, he was also a big unionist. And so if you had to think about if there was a political party that he would mostly be associated with, while he could have been considered a Democratic Republican, his actions basically said that he acted as more in a Federalist. And so one of the things that happened with the nullification crisis is that Jackson did not like for his power as president to be challenged. And he kind of felt that with South Carolina, especially the fact that his former vice president, John C. Calhoun, was one of the people who was kind of leading the way down there. He kind of felt like it was openly defiant to him. So he took things kind of personal. Him waging the war with the Second Bank of the United States. He did many things in order to crush the bank, including pulling a lot of federal funding out of out of the Second Bank of the United States, and then dispersing them into smaller state banks. But one of the things that he kind of talked about was the fact that this tariff was huge and it needed to be done so that they can continue to finish, the federal government can balance out. And so when the nullification crisis exploded, of course, it was a huge tariff on imports. And so things that were kind of coming into the country. And so one of the things that South Carolina had enough of was they had enough of the federal government exercising its power. And so basically what they said was, well, if he was openly defiant and he was able to defy the Supreme Court, we don't actually have to collect the tariff. There's nothing in the Constitution that basically says that states have to collect taxes or tariffs based off of that. That, again, the Constitution was a living document. So they were still kind of working out the kinks as this went along. And so Jackson kind of hearing word that a convention was held, and especially the fact that his former vice president was down there kind of leading the way, he basically threatened to send federal troops down, and basically it says, if you don't do what I need you to do, I'm going to force you to do it. And so luckily a compromise was reached, and the tariff, while it wasn't completely let go, they actually lowered the tariff. And so South Carolina kind of felt that, okay, this is a good way. This is kind of a happy median. We don't have to pay all these tariffs on these imports that are coming into our goods and services. So yeah, we'll be okay. We're not going to secede from the Union. And so as this kind of suppressed, Jackson's whole idea or his moniker started to change. So he went from being, again, the common man's president, this guy who did the whole universal suffrage, the guy who believed that, talking and having, he was that president who, if there was a person who was going to have a barbecue at the White House, it would have been Jackson. To, now making threats towards, states of sending down federal troops. And then, of course, being one of the proponents that led to the Trail of Tears, which led to the decimation of the Cherokee Nation. So if you look at Jacksonian democracy in a perspective, what were the great things that happened from it? Well, number one, he did develop a two-party system, which is something that we still have in place today. Although there are other political parties, the two main political parties are going to be the Democrats and Republicans. And as we kind of get later on, you'll kind of learn how that the Federalists will become will kind of go away. And then, of course, the Democratic Republicans, that is going to kind of be a split. And they're going to kind of have the political parties that we have right now. His methods of campaigning were important to kind of help bring democracy to the common man. Again, that whole idea of universal suffrage, the idea of taking away those restrictions that were based off of religion and also based off of land ownership. Again, by the election of 1840, he actually had tripled, he basically had almost tripled the amount of voter turnout. 78% of eligible voters actually turned out for the election. So he did do some good. He did actually increase the people's ability to kind of really be interested inside of politics. Although his record as a politician, though some people will say that those parts of the Jacksonian democracy are good, once he actually took office, those are kind of, be a little bit of a difference. The fact that he acted a lot less democratic, about the fact that even though the Supreme Court had came into agreement with the Cherokee Nation, how he put out the Indian Removal Act, basically just defying the Supreme Court, which no other president had done before. He also threatened military action, which was something that had never been done before by a president. And then, of course, when you look at Jackson as an overall figure as far as presidency, he's a very interesting character. And as the video had said, the first video, a lot of the people who were the founding fathers had some concerns. Thomas Jefferson expressed concerns that he feared, quoted saying that he feared for the nation if Jackson were to ever become president. And so while Jacksonian democracy is a very interesting turn, what you start to see is a turn from the shift from the way presidents were. So before, again, everyone came from the South, everyone came from, they were very wealthy. That's going to kind of turn that trend. And then as we start to see future presidents, we're going to kind of see how the role of the presidency is really going to kind of change. So he would be the first, I guess you could say for history's sake, he'd be the first person to kind of make that transition and change the role of the presidency. All right, so let's jump into some reform movements. Now, reform, of course, means changes, and we've had reform movements before. If you remember the Great Awakening, the religious movement that started out first, where they wanted to kind of bring people back into the church. Especially since you saw the fall of a lot of theocratic governments and when the colonies were first developing. And now what we're going to have is called a second Great Awakening. And it's going to be like a series of Christian revivals throughout the nation where people realize that church doesn't necessarily have to be in a building, that church can be anywhere. And so they're going to start to go out and kind of gather members, especially when you think about the expansion. The United States under, with the Louisiana Purchase and westward expansion, people are starting to kind of go out and move either north or go out west. And so they really wanted to make sure that Christianity or religion kind of stood at the forefront. And so one of the things that was happening with the Second Great Awakening was you had ministers such as Charles Finney, who talked about the responsibility for Christian salvation, and basically how he talked about the individuals and how they could improve themselves and society through good works. And from the Second Great Awakening, we're going to kind of see other reform movements that are going to kind of make some changes and hopefully try to make those changes for the good. So if you are doing a DBQ or if you're writing about something where it talks about, say, like social changes from the period of 1800 to 1848, please know you do not actually have to know every single reform movement that happened during this time. If you're able to write very well about one particular movement and support your argument with good, strong facts, that can work. But it does help if you kind of can have some foundation or talk about different reform movements. All right, so let's talk about the temperance movement, which was a huge social movement. If you look at this political cartoon very quickly, you'll notice that here's a gentleman. He is sitting on the ground, kind of looking like he's against a tree. He has a bottle of what could be assumed as alcohol. And then from that, you'll notice that there's kind of like a dragon. So the temperance movement was all about alcoholism or trying to stop the rise of alcoholism and talks about the evils and pretty much eliminate alcohol consumption. Did it work back in the 1800s? No, but you will see that the temperance movement will be effective when you talk about, and here's a question for Twitterverse, which amendment will actually be put into the Constitution that will pretty much kind of, I guess we'll say, be the culmination of the temperance movement? Like it didn't work in the 1800s, but eventually it does work. So there was an amendment that was put out there that was called prohibition, which basically just says alcohol consumption and the sale of alcohol is illegal. So while it didn't work in the 1800s, it will eventually work later in the 1900s. They talk about abstinence from alcohol. Primarily, this was led by a lot of Christian leaders, women, really kind of started out in this temperance movement. They kind of saw it as, drinking was kind of a threat to American to family life at that time, especially when the men kind of gathered and would drink alcohol and would, they thought that, drinking alcohol would lead to all types of evils and would kind of dismantle the family unit. And of course, it did have an impact. It basically had a dramatic impact on the amount of alcohol that was consumed between the 1830s and the 1860s. So would it completely kind of take alcohol or eliminate alcohol consumption? No, that would not, again, happen until, if anybody can figure out which amendment basically prohibited the alcohol. All right, as we continue on, as we're still waiting for Twitterverse to answer that question, another thing that we're looking at is the abolitionist movement. This was very much so encouraged by the Second Great Awakening, really kind of looking at the Bible and kind of looking at what the Bible said about, evils and things like that. The abolitionist movement was led by people such as Frederick Douglass, even though technically Frederick Douglass wouldn't be considered like a free African American until after the amendment, until after the 13th Amendment ended slavery and the 14th Amendment gave citizenship. So up until that time, you consider that Frederick Douglass, for the majority of his life, was considered to be a runaway slave. But they also had white Americans such as William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown, who will lead these. But a lot of things with the abolitionist movement are really, really going to start to take place after a book was written. that talks about the evils of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was actually born up north, went down south to visit some of her relatives, and got a firsthand look at what the horrors of slavery was. And so she wrote this book. Of course, Southern states basically said that she embellished a lot of things, that she lied. And then, of course, it's actually going to fuel more people to kind of join the abolitionist movement. It would, lead to papers. For example, William Lloyd Garrison really kind of talks about African American rights and really kind of having slaves actually become citizens. He is going to have a newspaper called The Liberator, where he's going to publish things that were said, publish essays and things like that, really kind of putting his life on the line. He and Frederick Douglass worked tirelessly together in order to put copies of The Liberator out. You will have other abolitionists such as Sojourner Truth, and of course, Harriet Tubman and her plight with the Underground Railroad. The other thing that the abolitionists really tried to do was really try to create a bunch of anti-slavery societies and really try to appeal to the consciousness and basically kind of talk about how the Bible would not support the treatment, the evil treatments of slavery, even though in the South, um, a lot of Southern slave owners would use the Bible and basically just say that God put them in that position, that that was their role. And so, when you look at the abolitionist movement overall, a great thing that is going to continue, a trend is going to continue well into what will be known as the era of the Civil War. And of course, the answer with the 19th Amendment, Liliana Gordon was the first person to get it correct. So yes, the 19th Amendment was prohibition that did actually ban the sale and consumption of alcohol during that time. But once we kind of start talking about the Roaring Twenties, we'll talk about that more. And so another thing you need to kind of mention with the abolitionist movement is that a lot of the women from the temperance movement will actually kind of join in with the abolitionist movement as well. People like the Grimke sisters, as well as Harriet Beecher Stowe with her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Another big thing is women's rights. Huge women, a huge success. A lot of people who are under the abolitionist movement decided that they wanted to look at what women's rights were. And remember, this is not the first time that women's rights had came into play. When you think about it, with the founding fathers, with people like Abigail Adams, who was writing letters to her son and also to her husband, kind of telling them to remember the role that women played within the American Revolution. This was kind of a huge thing. And so they're going to hold a convention in Seneca Falls. And they're going to have an agenda where they're going to talk about the Declaration of Sentiments and kind of talking about the women's rights and kind of taking the words from the Declaration of Independence and basically talking about how women were excluded from that. And if you remember, Republican motherhood was a huge thing where women were supposed to stay home and, take care of the children and teach the children. They were kind of like the first source. If you remember that political cartoon that I showed you guys last week, there were some little books in there, if you remember, that talks about, women are people too, or women's role and their importance in the government. And so what they kind of came about was something called the cult of domesticity. And this, of course, was a restriction on women's rights, where they weren't allowed to attend school past a certain age. At a certain age, they're supposed to go back home and live with mother and learn how to be a wife and a mother and how to clean home, because eventually they're going to become of age where they're going to get married off. Women weren't allowed to attend certain social gatherings. They weren't allowed to attend. They weren't, of course, allowed to vote. It was kind of all about the moral conduct of women. And so they're going to challenge this. And so with the Seneca Falls convention, is going to be led by people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who are going to kind of look at the rights of women. And so they're kind of looking at, let's kind of put this all together. And so, sorry, Liliana, sorry, it is not the 19th Amendment. I apologize. I just realized it is actually the 18th Amendment. So yes, the 18th Amendment was the one that did prohibition. 19th Amendment actually is applicable to this slide, which is women's rights, and gave the women the right to vote. Sorry about that. That was my fault. I misread that. So we're kind of looking at the fact that, again, this is the same thing with the temperance movement, something that started in the 1800s and then will later in the 1900s actually be put into effect as an amendment within the Constitution. So again, if you're kind of looking at that continuity, kind of talking about, if you had a CCOT changes about something with reform movements from the 1800s to 1848, this would definitely be one that you can kind of talk about. And then kind of going beyond that, you can kind of talk about how the women's rights movement will completely change under Alice Paul, especially after World War I, which will eventually lead into the 19th Amendment being passed. All right. With the Seneca Falls Convention, you had a lot of people who spoke. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as I mentioned, Lucretia Mott, they were the ones who decided to organize this. A lot of people spoke, such as Sojourner Truth, and of course, kind of looking at those the values of the Victorian society, and then kind of looking at how women can still be women and still can, be the mothers and the heads of the family, play their role within the family and still be the head of the children, but also too, they can be involved in politics. And what a lot of people don't know is that, especially during this time when the women's movement was starting in the 1800s, you did have your first female candidate who actually did decide to run for the office of president. And so here's a question for Twitterverse. Can anybody guess who that person was? Again, who was going to be the first woman to actually run for office, the role of president? And this, of course, kind of was influenced by the women's rights movement that kind of started around this time. All right, so we talked about women, we've talked about the impact of Jacksonian democracy. What about African Americans during this time? Well, of course, African Americans pretty much weren't African Americans as of yet. They were actually slaves. And those that were no longer slaves that were free were just known as free blacks. They're not going to actually get that moniker of African Americans until much, much later, until after the 14th Amendment. But when you think about it, in the 1800s, there were 1 million Black people that were living in the country during that time. And then, of course, by 1850, that number had grown to about 3.6 million. Well, why and how did that happen? Of course, slavery, the idea of slave trade was outlawed. The southern states, and a lot of southern plantation owners had figured out that it was much cheaper to breed slaves as opposed to purchasing them. And so, depending on how much money or wealth you had, they definitely decided that it was a lot easier because once you breed a slave, that's going to be your slave anyway. There's no money, there's no exchange of currency. Many of them had been living uh, again, in enslavement. They were pretty much forced laborers on farms in the South and then in certain states out West. You kind of talked about the differences and how it was determined how states would be, whether states would be considered a slave state or a free state. And of course, with the Missouri Compromise, that's going to be a huge thing, as those that are below the 3630 line, with the exception of Missouri, will be slave states, and then those that are above were going to be free states. And that was because of the type of economic environment that they had. For the southern states, their type of environment was more agrarian, more plantation owners. Up north, they were becoming more industrialized. Again, for Blacks, slave owners denied them their basic rights, their liberties. They weren't allowed to do anything. Mr. Horton kind of talked to you guys about rebellions and uprisings, things that slaves would do to try to kind of their own form of protest. You will have other rebellions besides the Stono Rebellion. Nat Turner will lead a rebellion as well. And so those who managed to escape the horrors of slavery, if they were able to run away and actually be successful, many of them lived in areas or cities up north. There were some free certain areas up in this, like what they call the upper South, where some people, former slaves, could actually live and pretty much kind of play a prominent role. And from there, they're going to kind of take on different roles as far as the abolitionist movement in order to fight the end of slavery and also to help those slaves who were wanting to be free to kind of help them escape. And so they're going to play very integral roles as it pertains. But for the most part, for the early republic, in a lot of southern states, slaves will actually outnumber their owners. Congratulations to Claudia D., who did get the answer correct of who's going to be the first female to run for president. Her name was Victoria Woodhull. All right, so we talked about, that the North was becoming more industrial-like. having the factory systems, using ships to kind of move in and out. Well, what about the southern states? Well, they're going to be known as the Cotton Kingdom. And in 1850, a lot of states down in the deep south are going to be known as that Cotton Kingdom because of the fact that they had a lot of vast plantations. Now, remember when the colonies first formed, their cash crop was tobacco. Well, soil erosion kind of soil erosion happened because of the overproduction of tobacco. And then they realized that they can grow other things like rice, indigo, and then cotton. And so eventually the southern states are going to be probably like the biggest cotton producers in the world. Especially for the deep south, it was known as having a lot of single-minded focus, especially on a more agricultural basis, so an agrarian society. They really didn't see the need to have factories there because of the fact that plantations were pretty much dependent upon having a lot of land. Um, you had a lot of noteworthy cities that are going to develop, New Orleans, Charleston, Atlanta eventually. A lot of those ports that they had were going to be known for shipping cotton on the international market. So you even had countries like Britain who actually came to the southern states for their cotton in order to get their cotton. Um, we're talking about, is exactly so the complete exact opposite of what was happening up north. So while urbanization and industrialization was going up north, down south, not so much. So they're going to be known as the Cotton Kingdom. So to kind of give you an idea, these states, kind of looking at this map, this will be a map of it during that time, right around in this area will be kind of where the Cotton State or the Cotton Kingdom would be. So you'll see like a little small portion of Florida, but pretty much like in the areas of Georgia, South Carolina, especially. But you remember South Carolina also had rice and indigo, so because they were more coastal. Over here, Alabama, Mississippi. So if you were shown this map, say, for example, and you were kind of looking at talking about the economic changes that impacted America during that time, you should be able to kind of look at this and see that this is the Cotton Kingdom here, and really kind of talk about, get more in depth of how did these states become the Cotton Kingdom, and really kind of talk about the focus of the invention of the cotton gin, the fact that, slavery was more prominent down south. And of course, once the cotton gin came about, the production of cotton is going to be increased. And so therefore the need for more slaves will actually going to be needed. And therefore it's going to be increasing the amount of slaves that are going to be used. And then you'll notice that here with the 3630 line right here, which is where it was determined which states would be free states and slave states. And of course, Missouri right up in here, of course, would actually become a slave state. All right, so we're talking about the overall big picture of period 4. Here are some things I just want you guys to remember. Number one, the United States developed its own democratic ideas to sparking debates about the role of federal government leading up to the formation of various political parties. Now, keep in mind when Washington was president in his farewell address, he did kind of warn about the evils of having political parties and kind of staying away from party alignment. And the question is, would he be proud if he were alive to see the United States today? The other thing is the Supreme Court established a principle that federal laws take precedence over state laws, kind of looking at Marbury versus Madison, and then of course, kind of looking at other Supreme Court cases that will happen as a result of that. 3, America developed a national culture, especially after the War of 1812, with various religious and social reform groups that emerged. Again, kind of talking about the Second Great Awakening, looking at the temperance movement, looking at women's rights, and also the abolitionist movement, and how they wanted to really kind of make an impact and kind of change the roles. Number 4, they underwent an economic and technological revolution, a lot of major developments. Could the South have became more industrial because of the cotton gin? Probably, but of course they didn't. They kind of went more the agrarian way, especially since their economic society was heavily dependent upon slavery. You had the invention of the steam engine, the factory system, and then the fact that you had the expansion of railroads and canals. Now, the southern states, while they did not have a lot of ports, they did use railroads. Atlanta will become a major railroad hub, especially for the southern states when they were moving cotton in order to the coast in order to import. Expanding westward after the Louisiana Purchase, will kind of play a major role in what will be known as manifest destiny, especially when it kind of talks about expanding the borders and kind of engaging in more foreign trade. And then the last thing is, as new states join the United States, the debate for slavery will really kind of wage on. It will kind of have, with Henry Clay or the Great Compromiser, as Mr. Horton kind of explained to you guys, we'll have the Missouri Compromise, but then what's going to happen is it's going to kind of lead to some tension. So as you think about these 6 things that impacted period 4, really kind of think about how we're on the road to the Civil War. Kind of talking about what will be known as sectionalism, kind of thinking about how, the North and the South will kind of be pitted against each other. And then out West, as people are starting to figure out things. And as we're kind of making our way to the Civil War, how the country is shifting and how it's not really we're operating as one big country, but we're kind of operating as just different entities. The North kind of sees itself as industrial and more, more, I guess, advanced than the Southern states will. And they kind of feel like they're their own independent, and then they're their own independent of the North. And of course, you have the West, who are still trying to figure out what are they going to become. And then, of course, with the theories of manifest destiny, that's really going to kind of change things as well. All right, so very quickly, if you want to take a picture of this, this is ABC's, a period 4 that kind of goes through important people, things that we've talked about, some things that we've touched on, and of course, for the spirit of time, things that we weren't able to talk about. Kind of keep that in your notes, especially as you're kind of getting prepared for your AP exam. So I'll give you a few minutes. And while I'm waiting on that, Mr. Horton wants me to do a shout out to McLean High School. So. All right, so let's do a bit of practice. All right, so here is a question. This is a DBQ question. It says, analyze the extent to which political and economic changes reshaped American society between 1820 to 1848. So again, if you're writing your DBQ, you're going to have 2 things that you're going to have to address in your thesis statement. You're going to have to talk about the political changes that you notice as you're kind of reading through your documents, and then again with your economic changes. Keep in mind when you're doing this, create your list of things that you talked about from 1820 to 1848. Kind of think about, Cotton Kingdom, about the industrial North, as something that you can create your list before you read your document. Kind of talk about, when they talk about the political changes, you can look at some of the laws that were put into place. You can look at things that happened under Jacksonian democracy, for example. So take a few minutes and read through this, and then we'll kind of talk about it, ways that you can use this document and whether or not it will be considered political or economic. Okay, so clearly this is focusing in on economics. It's kind of talking about, he makes mention of using a protective tariff. He kind of talks about industries. He's looking at domestic industry, is kind of looking at the changes. So he's basically, if you look at it, domestic industry is no longer represented by the ruddy matron sitting at her own fireside in her own home, turning a spinning wheel with one foot and rocking a chubby bantling child with the other, while singing it to sleep with lullabies. And so basically, if you look at it in 1842, kind of talking about tariffs and kind of looking at the fact that, looking at the demands and kind of talking about, the ways that things were kind of looking at, as well as, the taskmaster. And so when you're looking at this, kind of think about in 1842 what was happening during that time. Why would this person be focused in kind of talking about domestic industry? Why is it talking about factories? Kind of talking about the protective tariffs. What would have been happening during that time for him to be so feeling so strongly, and why is he bringing up women? So clearly this is kind of talking about the role of women as well, and kind of talking about the economic changes in society as well, because believe it or not, there were some women who actually did work in certain factories. But again, this person's kind of talking about the fact that it was a bondage, it was oppressive. So he's talking about the need for changes or working environments, kind of talking about the fact that while these factories were big and they were needed, the working environment wasn't working so well for them. And so there kind of needed to be some reform movements. All right. Oh, okay. This one, sorry. All right, so very quickly, same question, a different one. This one is called by Michael Chevalier, talking about society, manners, and politics in the United States, kind of figuring out whether or not this will be political and economic changes that reshaped American society between 1820 to 1848. So if you'll take a few minutes. Okay, so this is a different perspective compared to the other one, whereas the other one was talking about the evils of factory life and about why they're not needed. This one is basically saying, everything has become an object of speculation. Kind of talking about cotton, kind of talking about land, kind of talking about, how, the boom today must be followed by a crisis tomorrow, and kind of talking about the fact that, all these things are springing up, but at the end of the day, with all these factory systems, the country is gaining, like you're having increased wealth. You're having enterprise that's happening. You're having men who are able to kind of be a part of the influence. They're having a lot of political things. So this can be an argument for both political and economic changes, kind of talking about how the role of men are being shaped as industry is growing, mentioning banks, kind of talking about the fact of, this whole thing about society, politics, and manners, and how all this kind of dependent upon one another, how all of these are kind of looking at the emergence and about how we are technologically changing, we're becoming more advanced, and the country is being able to compete on many different levels than they had not been able to before, prior to that. And so, kind of looking at this document, kind of looking at the experiment, and kind of talking about it, they're advocating for enterprise, and they're also advocating for the role of the many changes that are happening and how the country is getting richer as a result of enterprise. All right, so very quickly, because I know we're running out of time here, kind of the key takeaways is the fact that we have new political parties that are going to come out. So what you're going to have now are kind of like the Jacksonian Democrats, and then you're going to have a party known as the Whigs, who actually oppose Jackson, and they're actually going to be more, so I guess, former supporters of the British Crown. We're going to kind of talk about the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs, kind of talking about, moral and social reforms and other things like utopian and religious movements. And then, of course, the United States beginning to develop modern democracy and also a change to new national culture. So overall, our lesson was about the impact of Jacksonian democracy and how it completely changes things from the beginning to where we are now. And we kind of talked about a couple of the reform movements and kind of looked at the role of where women are now, and then for Blacks at the time. And so finally, we're going to do one thing. Here is a political cartoon. And if you had a question that says, explain the point of view reflected in the image above about one of the following. So again, one. So you either look at technology, commerce, or the national environment. What are some things that you would write about? So just take a few minutes and kind of look at the cartoon very carefully. Okay, so I'm going to break it down for you so that you will know. So if you had a POV for technology, you could definitely kind of talk about the presence of the train, the rail track, the steamboat, the tunnel, all that, and how it's illustrated in a positive light. Basically kind of talking about even the title itself kind of talks about how technology is an integral part of progress and economic growth. If you decided to focus in on commerce, then of course you could talk about the telegraph, the light machinery, transportation, even again, how it's beneficial. Not really what you would see as visible negatives, of course, because of course what happens is as all this starts to happen, you will start to see people kind of talking about low wages, strikes, and unsafe working conditions, kind of going back to that that very first document that we looked at, where it was kind of talking about the evils and the whole domestic factory system and all that. And of course, the telegraph worker is middle class, he's well dressed, he's relaxed, while the other workers also appear to be artisans, educated, and content. And so it was an emphasis on small businesses and not necessarily factories, kind of going in with what happened with that very first document that we looked at. And then if you looked at the natural environment, it would basically kind of suggest a positive aspect about humans subduing the natural environment. Of course, you notice that it doesn't have trees or animals, which of course that wasn't the case. The mountain had been so-called conquered by the tunnel. And of course, the land, as you're looking at the expansion of the railroad system, and then of course, with the river being conquered by the steamboat. And then of course, all of this is kind of a tranquil setting. So something to think about for tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'll be with you guys. We're going to talk about the impact of manifest destiny, which is, the idea of settling from sea to sea or ocean to ocean. We're going to kind of talk about an impact on Native Americans, on Mexico, because of course that's a territory we're kind of moving into with the Spanish that are still there, and also farmers. And before we go, a shout out to Miss McGinnis at Kamowasogi. I'm pretty sure I pronounced that incorrectly. High school, as well as Miss Clemens at Grassville High School. So sorry for going over today, guys, but again, Jacksonian democracy is a lot. So we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.